The savannah air, thick as wet wool, clung to Detective Kendra Moss's skin. It was a Tuesday night that felt like a Friday, the kind of night where trouble brewed in the city's shadowed corners, like a bitter tea. She was pressed against the rough brick of an alley off River Street, her Glock 19 held steady, its dark form a stark contrast to the neon glow bleeding from the bars nearby. The air smelled of stale beer, river water, and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Her fear, and the fear of the man cowering 20 feet away. "Drop it, Marcus," she commanded, her voice a low, steady growl that cut through the humidity. "Don't make this worse than it has to be." Marcus, a low-level crack dealer with a history of bad decisions, was shaking, his eyes wide and wild. A cheap silver pistol trembled in his hand, catching the strobing lights from a nearby club. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. Kendra's world had narrowed to the space between her front sight and his chest. The sounds of tourists laughing and music thumping felt a world away. Here, in this grimy theater, there was only the humid air, the tension, and the potential for a sudden, violent end. "They'll kill me, Moss!" he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "You don't understand. I can't go back." "You'll die right here if you don't drop the gun," Kendra countered, her tone devoid of sympathy. She'd heard it all before. The justifications, the desperation. It was a tired old song she had no patience for tonight. She shifted her weight, a subtle movement, anchoring herself. He was looking for an out, a moment of hesitation. She wouldn't give it to him. She saw the flicker in his eyes, the tightening of his finger on the trigger. It was the moment of decision. Instead of a gunshot, a wail of sirens sliced the air, growing closer. The cavalry. Marcus's face crumpled. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the grim finality of surrender. The silver pistol clattered to the greasy pavement. Kendra didn't relax. She moved forward, a shadow detaching from the wall, her own movements economical and precise. "On the ground. Hands behind your back. Now." As she clicked the cold steel of the cuffs around his wrists, the adrenaline began its slow retreat, leaving the familiar weariness in its wake. Another Tuesday, another ghost for the system. Her radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice tinny and urgent, cutting through the aftermath. "All units be advised. We have a 187 at the Spanish Moss Inn on the south side, room 23. Responding units report a possible DOA, female victim. Detective Moss, are you clear to respond?" Kendra keyed her mic, her voice flat. "Moss is clear, en route." The Spanish Moss Inn. The name left a sour taste in her mouth. It wasn't an inn, it was a purgatory. A collection of sad single-story buildings festering off the interstate, where rooms were rented by the hour and secrets were buried under threadbare carpets. It was a place where hope went to die. She hauled Marcus to his feet, handing him off to the arriving patrol officers with a clipped summary. She ignored their curious glances, the way they looked from the sweating dealer to the black female detective who had taken him down alone. Driving through the sleeping city, the ancient oaks dripped with Spanish moss that looked like the devil's laundry in the yellow glow of the streetlights. Savannah could be beautiful, a postcard of southern charm, but Kendra knew its other face, the one hidden in the alleys and the hourly rate motels. It was a face scarred by poverty, desperation, and violence. As she pulled up to the Spanish Moss Inn, the scene was already a chaotic tableau of light and shadow. The flashing red and blue of patrol cars painted anxious strokes against the motel's peeling, pale yellow walls. Yellow police tape, stark and clinical, was already stretched, cordoning off a piece of the world, transforming it into a crime scene. A small crowd of onlookers, motel residents in bathrobes and weary travelers, had gathered at a distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and fear. She killed the engine, the silence in her car suddenly deafening after the wail of the sirens. She took a deep breath, the heavy swamp-cooled air doing little to calm the familiar knot in her stomach. This was the start, the descent into someone else's final, terrible moments. She grabbed her leather-bound notebook and her badge, the weight of it a familiar anchor. Stepping out of her unmarked Ford, she walked toward the yellow tape, toward the silent, waiting room. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the night air, that whatever was behind the door of room 23, it had been waiting for her all along. Kendra ducked under the yellow tape, the plastic crinkling softly. A young, fresh-faced patrolman, Miller, held it up for her. His name tag was shiny, his uniform crisp. He couldn't have been more than 25. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his Georgia drawl thick. "The M.E. is already inside." Ma'am, not detective. Kendra's eyes, tired but missing nothing, met his for a fraction of a second. It was a small thing, a flick of the tongue, but in the South, it was a language all its own. It was the subtle, casual dismissal she'd been navigating her entire career in a department still dominated by men who looked like Miller. She gave a curt nod, letting the slight slide off her like rainwater. There was no time for it. "Give me the rundown, officer." Maid found her around 7 p.m., when the client didn't check out. "Door was unlocked," he recited. "All business now. No obvious signs of forced entry. The door to room 23 was ajar, a silent invitation into the horror within." Kendra pulled on a pair of latex gloves, the snap against her wrist, a small, sharp punctuation mark. The air that drifted out was a foul cocktail, stale cigarette smoke, the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume, and underneath it all, the coppery, unmistakable scent of shed blood and death. It was the smell of violence, and it never got easier. The room was small and squalid, a faded floral bedspread, a scarred wooden dresser, a television bolted to the wall. Forensics techs in their white jumpsuits moved with a practiced, almost balletic grace, dusting for prints and placing small evidence markers. The scene was a study in contrasts, a violent disruption of a space meant for transient anonymity. On the bed lay the victim, partially covered by a sheet. The shape beneath it was small, fragile. Dr. Rodney Tucker, the county's medical examiner, stood beside the bed, his face grim. He was a man in his late 60s with his kind eyes that had seen too much, the weariness etched into the lines around them. He and Kendra had worked dozens of cases together, a grim partnership built on mutual respect. "Rod," Kendra said, her voice low, "tell me it wasn't as bad as it smells." Tucker let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire city. "If I told you that, I'd be lying. It's bad, Kendra. Real bad." The room's squalor was sharply contrasted by a single point of order. On a rickety chair in the corner, a set of clothes, a simple sundress and sandals, was folded with meticulous care. Her purse sat on the nightstand, its contents spilled out, but the wallet itself was still there, cash visible inside. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else. This was personal. Victim's name is Cheyenne Tibbs, according to the ID in her wallet. Age 24, Tucker said, flipping a page on his clipboard. Time of death is preliminary, but I'm putting it somewhere between 1 and 3 a.m. Cause of death is pretty clear. Manual strangulation. But that came after the beating. Kendra stepped closer. Tucker gently pulled back the sheet. The breath caught in her throat. Cheyenne Tibbs had once been beautiful. You could see it in the high cheekbones, the elegant line of her jaw. But now, her face was a grotesque mask of purple and black bruises. Her nose was clearly broken, her lips split and swollen. Dark, finger-shaped marks marred the delicate skin of her neck. A brutal necklace of violence. The rage of the killer was written all over her body. "He was furious," Kendra murmured, her mind already working, piecing together the narrative of the crime. This wasn't a clean, professional hit. This was a storm of pure, unrestrained fury, an explosion. "That's the understatement of the year," Tucker grumbled. "He broke 2 of her ribs, probably with his fists or knees. No weapon found at the scene, which means he did all this with his bare hands. He wanted to feel it." Kendra's gaze swept the room again. 2 wine glasses on the dresser, one with a lipstick stain on the rim, the other half full. A cheap bottle of Pinot Grigio stood between them. "She had company." "Agreed. Forensics has swabbed them both for DNA and prints," Tucker confirmed. He paused, his expression shifting. "There's something else, Kendra. Something that might be relevant to the motive." He gestured to the victim's body. "During my initial examination, I noted surgical scars, faint but there, and the hormone levels I can already tell are off-kilter for a biological female. Her ID says female, and she presents as female in every way, but Cheyenne Tibbs was a transgender woman." Kendra absorbed the information, her expression unreadable. In the brutal calculus of murder investigations, identity was everything. It could be a motive, a target, a reason. And in a city like Savannah, with its deep-seated traditions and its equally deep-seated prejudices, being a transgender woman of color puts you at the intersection of multiple dangerous roads. That changes the landscape, Kendra said, making a note. It might, Tucker agreed. He then leaned in closer, pointing with a gloved finger to a dark bruise on Cheyenne's wrist, just above where her hands were clenched into fists. And look at this. It's odd. Kendra squinted. Clinging to the discolored skin, almost invisible against the dark bruising, was a single, coarse black hair. It was short, stiff. Animal? She asked. Looks like it. Not human, that's for sure. Too thick. Maybe a dog, Tucker mused. We'll get it to the lab, but it's a strange piece of trace evidence to find in a motel room, bagged and tagged. A single out-of-place dog hair. It was a tiny, insignificant detail, in a room screaming with violence. But Kendra knew from long, hard experience that it was often the smallest, quietest clues that screamed the loudest, long after the echoes of the crime had faded. This wasn't just a detail, it was a loose thread, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she had to pull it. The forensics tech handed Kendra the victim's phone in a sealed evidence bag. It was a slightly older model iPhone, the screen cracked in one corner. We got the pin from her notepad. It was 1111, the tech said with a slight shake of his head. Not exactly Fort Knox. The trusting ones never are, Kendra muttered, taking the bag. She found a quiet corner of the room, away from the grim tableau on the bed, and carefully entered the code. The phone sprang to life, its screen a cheerful, incongruous blue. The background was a selfie of Cheyenne, smiling, head tilted, a life force so vibrant it felt like a physical blow. Kendra pushed aside the pang of sorrow and got to work. Her job was not to mourn, but to avenge. She scrolled through the call logs and messages. Most were mundane, texts from friends, notifications from apps. But the last conversation, from the previous night, stood out. It was with a contact saved only as LB. The exchange was brief, chillingly transactional. LB, Blue Moon Motel, Room 23, 8 p.m. Cheyenne, $200 for the hour, like we agreed. LB, yeah, see you then. It was the last message Cheyenne ever received. Kendra screenshotted the conversation and the contact's number, sending it off to the tech squad at the precinct with a simple command: ID this number, priority. The phone was a digital ghost, a map of Cheyenne's final hours. But it was a map with a dead end. To find the path forward, she needed to talk to the living. She found Harold Jenkins behind the front desk in the motel's lobby. The lobby was a sad time capsule of a room, smelling of pine sol and despair. The peeling counter was littered with old newspapers and a half-eaten donut. Harold himself looked like a fixture of the place. A man in his late 50s with thinning, greasy hair, a stained shirt, and a permanently sour expression. Detective Moss, Savannah PD, Kendra said, flashing her badge. The gold shield seemed to mock the dingy surroundings. You were on duty tonight? I'm always on duty, Harold grumbled, not looking up from a crossword puzzle. This place is my life, has been for 30 years, a real ball and chain. I'm investigating the death in room 23, Kendra said, her voice intentionally flat. Harold finally looked up, his eyes watery and resentful. Tragedy, real tragedy. I always told them girls they was taking a risk. Them girls? Kendra pressed, her internal radar pinging. Harold shifted uncomfortably, a flush creeping up his neck. You know, the working girls, call girls. Cheyenne, she was a regular, once or twice a week. Good girl, though, he added, as if to soften the judgment. Always polite, never caused no trouble. His words were a mix of condescension and a strange, proprietary fondness. He was the gatekeeper of this little kingdom of misery. Did you see who she was with last night? A man, checked in around 8, paid cash for 3 hours. Harold's gaze darted around the lobby, avoiding hers. White fella, tall, built solid, maybe mid-30s. Did you get a name, a license plate? Paid cash, no ID required. That's our policy for the hourlies, he said with a shrug. As for his car, saw a dark pickup truck, Older model, Ford maybe. Couldn't see the plate. It was dark. Did you notice anything unusual when he left? Harold hesitated, scratching at his chin. The gesture was just a little too deliberate. He came out around 11, maybe a little after, looked jumpy, agitated, was muttering to himself. I asked if everything was all right, and he just slapped the key on the counter and stormed out. Didn't say a word. It was a good story, maybe too good, practiced. You have security cameras, Mr. Jenkins? Kendra asked, her eyes scanning the lobby and landing on a dusty dome camera mounted in the corner. Harold immediately shook his head, a little too quickly. Nah, that thing's just a dummy. Ain't worked in years, just there to scare off the kids. Kendra's gaze lingered on the camera. From her angle, she could see the ceiling around it was a slightly lighter shade of white, free of the yellowish grime that coated everything else. But right next to the camera's base, there was a small, perfectly clean arc in the dust, as if the camera had been recently swiveled. A small detail, an insignificant detail, just like the dog hair. Her instincts, honed by a decade of listening to liars, were screaming. Harold was holding something back. He was either scared of the killer, or he was involved. Or maybe he just didn't want the hassle, the police attention that would inevitably scare away his clientele. Whatever the reason, he was lying. If you remember anything else, Mr. Jenkins, anything at all, you call me, she said, placing her card on the counter. She deliberately placed it over his half-finished crossword. We take the murder of a citizen in this city very seriously, regardless of their profession. She turned and walked out, feeling his resentful eyes on her back. The humid night air felt clean after the stale atmosphere of the lobby. She looked back at the dummy camera in the corner, a dark, unblinking eye. Harold thought it was blind, a useless piece of plastic. But Kendra had a feeling it had seen everything. The ghosts in the machine were just waiting for someone to press play. And she was going to be the one to do it. Cheyenne Tibbs's apartment was on the third floor of a tired-looking brick building in a part of Savannah that tourists never saw. The east side was a neighborhood of contrasts, pockets of gentrification, pushing up against blocks of weathered, low-income housing. It was a place of resilience and struggle, and Cheyenne's building was firmly in the latter category. The patrol officer who'd met her there had already gotten the building manager to unlock the door. As Kendra stepped inside, she was immediately struck by the disconnect between the building's shabby exterior and the world Cheyenne had created within these four walls. The studio apartment was small, but it was immaculate. It was a space filled with defiant color and life. Brightly colored curtains framed a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Inexpensive but tasteful furniture was arranged to maximize the small space. It was the home of someone who cared, someone who was building a life, not just surviving. The air inside smelled faintly of vanilla and clean laundry, a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the stench of death in room 23. This was where Cheyenne lived. The motel was just where she died. The distinction felt profoundly important. On the walls, a collection of framed photos showed Cheyenne smiling, laughing with other young women. In every picture, she radiated a joyful, carefree energy. Kendra felt a familiar ache. Her job forced her to meet people at their absolute worst, to sift through the wreckage of their final moments. It was a rare, bittersweet privilege to get a glimpse of them at their best. Kendra began her search, her movements methodical and respectful. This was a violation, she knew, but a necessary one. She opened drawers and cabinets, taking in the details of a life cut short. In the small, tidy kitchen, the fridge held fresh vegetables and a carton of almond milk. A grocery list was stuck to the door with a magnet shaped like a flamingo. Salad, tofu, quinoa, the mundane artifacts of a life in progress. In the bathroom, neatly arranged on a shelf, she found several vials of medication, estrogen and spironolactone, the chemical building blocks of Cheyenne's identity, sitting right next to a bottle of drugstore mascara and a tube of bright red lipstick. On the small table beside the bed, she found a worn daily planner. It was filled with notes, appointments, names, dates, and dollar amounts scribbled in a neat looping script. It was a ledger of her work, but also of her life. Lunch with Desi, 2 p.m. Doctor appointment, 4 p.m. In one of the dresser drawers, tucked beneath a stack of perfectly folded sweaters, Kendra found a simple photo envelope. Inside were pictures that chronicled a journey. They showed Cheyenne at different stages of her transition. A lanky, sad-eyed teenager with soft features evolved, photo by photo, into the confident, radiant young woman from the pictures on the wall. On the back of one photo, a snapshot of Cheyenne smiling, her face still showing the faint swelling of recent surgery, was an inscription in her own hand. My true beginning. Year 2022. It was a declaration of self, a testament to her fight to become the person she was always meant to be. The weight of the tragedy settled more heavily on Kendra's shoulders. This wasn't just a murder, it was the erasure of a hard-won existence. Among a stack of bills, all paid on time, she noted, was a copy of her lease agreement. Listed as the emergency contact was a name. Desiree Williams. The same Desi from the planner. Kendra wrote down the address and phone number. This was her next stop, her next link in the chain. She was about to leave when she noticed something glinting on the windowsill, almost hidden behind a small potted succulent. It was a small, tarnished silver jewelry box. She opened it. Inside lay a few pieces of simple jewelry, a silver chain, a pair of hoop earrings, and a small folded note. The paper was worn, as if it had been read many times. Kendra carefully unfolded it. The message was written in a different, stronger hand. Always remember you are real. Loving you, D. Kendra stared at the note. D. Desiree? It was a message of affirmation, a lifeline in a world that likely tried to tell Cheyenne she was anything but real. She carefully placed the note back in the box, her gloved fingers gentle. As she did, she saw something else, something she hadn't noticed before, wedged between the apartment door and the frame, low to the ground. It was a small, folded piece of cheap lined paper, as if torn from a spiral notebook. It must have been slipped under the door. She knelt and carefully worked it free with the tip of a pen. It hadn't been there when the patrol officer first arrived. He would have seen it. This was recent, sometime in the last day. She unfolded it. The words were scrawled in an aggressive, jagged block print. The pen having pressed so hard, it almost tore through the paper. There were only 8 words. You will pay for your lies. The message was a shard of ice in the warm, hopeful space Cheyenne had created. It was a voice from the outside, a voice of pure menace. This wasn't a business dispute. This wasn't a robbery. This was a threat, a promise of violent retribution. The case had just taken another dark, sharp turn, and Kendra felt a cold dread creep up her spine. The killer, or someone who knew him, was still out there, and they were sending messages. Desiree Williams lived in a slightly nicer, but still modest, apartment complex just a few miles from Cheyenne's. The building had a fresh coat of paint and potted ferns flanking the entrance. It was a step up, a sign of a life with a little more stability. When Kendra knocked, she heard movement inside, then silence. She knocked again, louder this time. Ms. Williams, Detective Moss, Savannah PD. I need to speak with you about Cheyenne Tibbs. The door opened a crack, held by a brass security chain. A single, terrified eye peered out. Police? The voice whispered. Yes. May I come in? It's important. The chain rattled, and the door swung open. Desiree Williams was a slender young woman with her hair in long, intricate braids. Her face was beautiful, but it was overshadowed by a deep, weary fear that seemed to have settled in her bones. The moment she saw Kendra's solemn expression, the fear in her eyes was joined by a heartbreaking resignation. She's gone, isn't she? Desiree whispered, her voice barely audible. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of her deepest dread. I'm so sorry, Kendra said softly. Cheyenne was killed last night. A choked sob escaped Desiree's lips, and she swayed on her feet. Kendra instinctively reached out to steady her. Please, let's sit down. She guided the trembling young woman into a small, cozy living room. Like Cheyenne's place, it was neat and decorated with personal touches, but a cloud of palpable fear hung in the air. I knew it. I knew something like this would happen, Desiree said, sinking onto the couch and pulling her knees to her chest. She began to rock back and forth, a picture of pure grief. In this life, it's always a risk. Always. You two were close? Kendra asked, giving her a moment. Close? We were sisters, Desiree said, her voice cracking. Not by blood, by survival. I met her 3 years ago when she first came to Savannah. She was so young, so new to it all. I tried to look out for her. She finally looked at Kendra, her eyes swimming with tears. Who did this to her? That's what I'm trying to find out. The last person she was with was a client, a man named Lavelle Bradford. Does that name mean anything to you? Desiree's brow furrowed in thought. Lavelle, I think she mentioned him, a new one, said he seemed nice, normal. Found her on a website, paid her asking price without trying to haggle. That's rare. Cheyenne didn't always disclose that she was transgender to new clients, did she? Kendra asked gently. Desiree looked away, picking at a loose thread on her sofa cushion. She wanted them to see her. The woman. Not the story, not the label. She said if they were decent, it wouldn't matter. I told her she was being naive. I told her this world isn't that kind, especially not to us. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Some men, when they find out, they see it as a trick, a deception. Their pride gets hurt and they get ugly. This was the heart of it. The motive that had been lurking in the background from the moment Tucker had spoken the words, transgender woman. It was a story Kendra had heard before, in other cases, with other victims. A story of toxic masculinity and fragile egos exploding into violence. Has she had trouble before? Desiree nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. A couple of times. Nothing like this. A guy got rough last year, but Tavon took care of it. The name hung in the air. Tavon, Kendra pressed. Desiree's entire body tensed. The fear that had been simmering beneath her grief now flooded her face. She looked like a trapped animal. I shouldn't have said that. Forget I said that. Desiree, I can't forget it. Who is Tavon? Kendra's voice was soft but firm. He's nobody, just a guy. The truth, Kendra insisted. It's the only way to get justice for Cheyenne. Desiree finally broke. He's not a pimp, not really, she said, the words tumbling out in a rushed whisper. He's security, a manager. He connects us with richer clients, the ones who don't want to be seen on websites. He keeps the trouble away, for a price, a big price. She was talking about Tavon Gaines, a name Kendra knew. He was a slick, untouchable figure who ran half the city's underground nightlife, always operating through layers of deniability. Did Cheyenne have a problem with him? She wanted out, Desiree said, her voice dropping even lower. She was saving money. She thought Tavon was taking too much, that he was holding her back. She was talking about leaving the life altogether, Tavon. He doesn't like it when his girls leave, especially not the ones who make him good money. Kendra felt a shift in the investigation. This was no longer just about a client's transphobic rage. This was about something bigger, more organized. She pulled out the Ziploc bag containing the threatening note she'd found at Cheyenne's apartment. She held it up. Have you ever seen handwriting like this? The moment Desiree's eyes focused on the jagged, angry letters, all the color drained from her face. She let out a small, strangled gasp and physically recoiled, pressing herself into the back of the couch as if to escape the piece of paper. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head violently. I don't know anything. Please, you have to go. Desiree, who wrote this? You don't understand, she hissed, her eyes wild with terror. He sees everything. He hears everything. Talking to you, it's a death sentence. For me, he'll know. He always knows. Her fear was primal and absolute. It was more than just fear of a violent pimp. It was the terror of someone who believed they were up against an omniscient, malevolent force. Kendra knew she couldn't push any further. Not now. She had gotten the name, and she had gotten the confirmation that this note was tied to something much deeper than a disgruntled client. She placed her card on the coffee table. If you change your mind, if you decide to talk, you call me. Day or night, I can protect you. Desiree just stared at the card, not moving, her body rigid with fear. As Kendra let herself out, the last thing she heard was the sound of the security chain rattling back into place, a final, futile attempt to lock the danger out. She walked away with two names, Lavelle Bradford and Tavon Gaines, and the chilling realization that Cheyenne's death might be caught in the crossfire of two different wars. One fought over her identity, and another fought over her freedom. Tavon Gaines operated out of a club called the Onyx Room, a sleek black-on-black establishment nestled in a gentrified corner of the historic district. It presented itself as a high-end jazz lounge, but Kendra knew it was the polished nerve center of Gaines's less savory enterprises. Getting to him wouldn't be easy. Men like Tavon surrounded themselves with walls, both literal and human. She chose to go in the evening when the club was alive. The bass line of a jazz trio pulsed through the heavy oak doors. A mountain of a man in a tailored suit stood guard, his expression bored and impassive. He looked Kendra up and down, his gaze lingering for a moment. A silent appraisal of the black woman in a sensible blazer, who clearly wasn't here for a $10 cocktail. "I need to see Tavon Gaines," she said, holding up her badge. "Police business." The bouncer's expression didn't change, but he tapped a finger to the earpiece he wore. He muttered something too low for her to hear, then nodded. Up the stairs, his office. The inside of the onyx room was a sea of dark wood, low lighting, and plush velvet. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume, and even more expensive bourbon. It was a world away from the Spanish Moss Inn, but Kendra knew the currency was the same: secrets and flesh. She climbed a spiral staircase to a mezzanine that overlooked the main floor. At the end of a short hall was a single door with a small brass plate that read, "T. Gaines, Private." She knocked. "Enter," a smooth baritone voice called out. Tavon Gaines's office was as impeccably styled as the rest of the club. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, and the wall behind it was a single pane of one-way glass, allowing him to survey his entire kingdom. Gaines himself sat in a high-backed leather chair, a portrait of cultivated power. He was handsome in a predatory way, with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent, watchful eyes. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Kendra's monthly salary. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist. "Detective," he said, his voice like velvet poured over gravel. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I hope my establishment hasn't fallen short of the city's esteemed standards." His smile was flawless, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes were cold, calculating. "I'm here about Cheyenne Tibbs," Kendra said, cutting through the pleasantries. She sat down, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She would not be intimidated. Tavon's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the only sign that the name registered. He recovered instantly, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "Ah, yes, a tragedy. I heard about it on the news. A terrible loss for our community." The way he said "our community" was layered with a cynical, patronizing irony. He was drawing a line, a shared racial identity, that he clearly believed he could leverage. Kendra wasn't biting. "She was more than a loss for the community, Mr. Gaines. She was a source of income for you." Tavon chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Detective? You wound me. Cheyenne was an independent contractor, a free spirit. I merely provided a platform, a certain level of security and clientele, for a modest fee. I was her business partner, not her keeper. Her friend, Desiree Williams, seems to think you kept a tight rein on your partners. She said Cheyenne wanted out." "Desiree is a sweet girl, but prone to drama," Tavon said dismissively, waving a hand. "And as for Cheyenne, she was ambitious, perhaps a little naive. She believed she could navigate the more treacherous waters of this business on her own. I advised against it, for her own safety." "Is that what happened to her? She navigated into treacherous waters?" "I believe," Tavon said, leaning forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially, "that she failed to appreciate the sensitivities of certain clients. In our line of work, detective, honesty is paramount, full disclosure. Cheyenne, bless her heart, sometimes chose privacy over prudence." He was talking about her being transgender, framing her murder as a consequence of her own supposed dishonesty. He was blaming the victim, artfully and cruelly. "And you think that's what got her killed?" Kendra asked, keeping her voice even. "A man discovers he's been deceived, shall we say, in an intimate setting. His pride is wounded. Things can escalate. It's a sad but predictable story." He sighed, a perfect performance of regret. Kendra watched him, a predator in a bespoke suit, spinning a tale that absolved him of everything. It was slick. It was plausible. And she didn't believe a word of it. "What about the note she received?" Kendra asked, her eyes locked on his. "The one that said, 'You will pay for your lies'?" Tavin's mask of cool indifference finally slipped. His eyes narrowed, the charm evaporating to reveal the cold steel beneath. He hadn't known about the note. She had just taken a piece off his chessboard. "I know nothing about any note," he said, his voice losing its velvet edge. "Sounds like you've found your angry client. Or I've found someone who wanted to make it look that way," Kendra countered. A heavy silence filled the office. The jazz from downstairs seemed distant, a soundtrack to their silent battle of wills. The door behind Kendra opened, and she didn't flinch. A large man, the same bouncer from the front door, stepped inside. He was huge, with a shaved head and a neck as thick as a tree trunk. By his side, on a thick leather leash, sat a Rottweiler, its massive head low, a low growl rumbling in its chest. The dog's coat was a glossy black. The message was clear. The conversation was over. Kendra stood up slowly, her gaze shifting from the dog to Tavon. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Gaines." "Always a pleasure to assist the law, detective," he said, his charming smile back in place. But it looked grotesque now, a mask on a skull. As she walked out of the office, the bouncer, whose name tag read Dante, stood aside to let her pass. As she did, he deliberately brushed his shoulder against hers, a hard, solid bump. It wasn't an accident. It was a physical punctuation mark, a warning. She didn't react, just continued down the stairs and out into the Savannah night. The cool air felt good on her skin. She had walked into the lion's den and walked out. But she hadn't left empty-handed. She had seen the flicker of surprise in Tavon's eyes about the note. She had seen the brute force he kept on a leash. And as she replayed the image of the massive black-furred Rottweiler in her mind, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place with chilling clarity. The single coarse black hair they had found on Cheyenne's bruised wrist. The next morning, the precinct was humming with the low-grade chaos of a new day. Coffee was brewing, phones were ringing, and the ghosts of last night's crimes lingered in case files stacked on desks. Kendra was at her own desk, a fortress of paperwork, staring at two names on her whiteboard, Lavelle Bradford and Taven Gaines. Two separate paths, two potential killers, one driven by bigoted rage, the other by cold, hard business. The problem was, she couldn't definitively connect either of them to the room. Her phone buzzed. It was the tech squad. "Got that number for you, detective," the voice on the other end said. "Belongs to a Lavelle Bradford, 32. Address is an apartment in West Chatham. Ran a background check. He's got one prior, assault, from a bar fight 3 years ago. Got off with a fine and probation." "Anything else?" Kendra asked. "Works as a mechanic at Ray's Premium Auto. Divorced, no kids, pays his bills on time. Looks pretty average, except for the assault charge." Average. Kendra hated that word. The most monstrous acts were often committed by average people. She thanked the tech and hung up, the first domino. She dispatched a patrol car to Bradford's address just to see if he was home. An hour later, the call came back. "Negative, detective. Apartment's empty. Spoke to a neighbor who said she hasn't seen him since the night before last. His truck is gone." Lavelle Bradford was in the wind. He was running. It was as good as a confession. Or was it? It was too easy, too neat. Her gut, the finely tuned instrument that had kept her alive and solved more cases than any database, was telling her something was off. The picture of the furious, out-of-control client didn't fully align with the cold, calculated threat of the note or the menacing presence of Tavon Gaines and his dog. She stared at the whiteboard, at the two names. Lavelle was the likely suspect, the one with the clear motive of transphobic rage. But Tavon had the power, the resources, and a reason to want Cheyenne silenced if she was planning to leave him. And he had the dog. "The dog hair," she said aloud to the empty office. The lab report had come back that morning. The hair found on Cheyenne's wrist was confirmed as canine, specifically from the Rottweiler breed. It was a direct physical link between the scene of the crime and Tovon's inner circle. It was more than Lavelle had. Right now, Lavelle was just a name from a text message and an empty apartment. The hair was physical. She walked down the hall to her captain's office. Captain Miller, no relation to the patrolman, but cut from the same old-school cloth, was a man who believed in clear-cut cases and quick closures. He didn't like messy. "Captain, I need a warrant for Tavon Gaines's club, and I need to question his primary employee, Dante, she said, standing in his doorway. Miller looked up from his paperwork, his expression already weary. On what grounds, Moss? A hunch? Gaines is slick. He's got lawyers who would tie this department in knots for years if you go at him without something solid. I have something solid. The lab confirmed the hair found on the victim was from a Rottweiler. Gaines's bodyguard owns a Rottweiler. I saw it myself last night. A dog hair? Miller scoffed, leaning back in his chair. There are thousands of Rottweilers in this city. A good lawyer would call that circumstantial at best. What about the other guy, the client? Bradford. He's missing, which is suspicious, I grant you, but he's a ghost. All I have connecting him is a text message. I have physical evidence pointing towards Gaines's circle. It's not enough, Moss. Not for a man like Gaines. Keep digging on Bradford. He's our horse in this race. He's a low-life mechanic, not a connected club owner. It's a simpler case. Let's not make it complicated. Kendra felt a familiar surge of frustration. A simpler case. He wanted the easy answer, the path of least resistance. He saw a dead trans woman of color, an angry blue-collar client, and he'd already written the story in his head. Tavon Gaines was too much trouble. It was a quiet, insidious form of institutional bias, valuing the difficulties of the prosecution over the pursuit of the whole truth. With all due respect, Captain, my job is to follow the evidence, and the evidence is leading me in two directions at once. And my job is to manage resources, Miller countered, his tone final. We don't have the manpower to chase shadows. Find Bradford. Kendra walked back to her office, the frustration burning in her chest. She was being stonewalled. She was at a dead end. Lavelle was gone. She couldn't get a warrant for Tavon. The case was in danger of stalling out. She sat at her desk, staring at the case file, the crime scene photos, the smiling face of Cheyenne, the ugly, jagged words on the note. Then her eyes landed on the report about the dog hair again. And an idea began to form. It was unorthodox. It was a long shot. And the captain would hate it. But if she couldn't get her warrants, maybe there was another way to follow the scent, a more literal way. She picked up her phone and dialed the extension for the K9 unit. Sergeant Riley, this is Detective Moss. I've got a strange request for you. I need your best nose. I need Shadow. Captain Miller had said no to chasing shadows, but he hadn't said anything about letting a shadow do the chasing for her. Sergeant Riley was a wiry man with a face tanned by years under the Georgia sun and a quiet intensity that mirrored that of his partner. His partner, Shadow, was a magnificent German shepherd, all lean muscle and intelligent amber eyes. He sat patiently by Riley's side, his focus absolute, waiting for the one word that would ignite him into action. Seek. Kendra met them at the Spanish Moss Inn. The yellow tape was gone, but the door to room 23 was sealed with an official police sticker. The air of violation still clung to the place. Captain Miller had grudgingly approved the use of the K9 unit, his skepticism palpable over the phone. Don't waste their time, Moss. This better lead somewhere. Shadow's sense of smell is about 40 times greater than ours, Detective, Riley explained as he geared up the dog. He can pick up a scent from skin cells, sweat, breath, even the hormonal changes caused by fear or rage. If your killer left a trace, Shadow will find it. The primary suspect, Lavelle Bradford, was in this room, Kendra said. But there was someone else. I'm sure of it. There was a dog hair, a Rottweiler's, found on the victim. Riley nodded. Dogs can often track the scent of other animals. It's a good place to start. What's the scent article? Kendra handed him a sealed evidence bag containing a piece of the bedsheet that had been under Cheyenne's body. A piece forensics had cleared for this purpose. Riley opened the bag and let Shadow take a long, deep sniff. The dog's entire demeanor changed. His body went taut. His ears pricked forward. He was no longer a pet. He was a precision instrument. Seek, Riley commanded, his voice low and firm. Shadow went to work. He bypassed the door to room 23, his nose to the ground. He moved with a purpose that was almost unnerving, casting back and forth across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. He ignored the sense of old oil stains and discarded fast food wrappers. He was on a specific trail, one invisible to the human eye. He led them past the rows of motel rooms, past the dumpster overflowing with trash, and toward the back of the property. Here, the manicured squalor of the motel gave way to the untamed wildness of the Georgia landscape. A thick line of trees and dense undergrowth bordered a marshy, low-lying area. It was the perfect place to discard something you didn't want found. Shadow didn't hesitate. He plunged into the brush, Riley and Kendra following close behind, branches whipping at their faces. The ground grew soft and muddy underfoot. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The dog stopped abruptly, about 50 yards into the woods. He began to whine, a low, anxious sound, and pawed at a patch of ground covered in damp leaves and loose soil. It was an area that looked no different from any other, but Shadow was insistent. "He's got something," Riley said, his voice tense with anticipation. He took a small trowel from his belt and began to carefully scrape away the top layer of earth. Kendra held her breath. A weapon? Bloody clothes? Something that would tie this all to Lavelle Bradford and close the case? But what Riley unearthed wasn't what she expected. It was a black trash bag, tightly knotted. He carefully sliced it open with a knife. Inside, nestled in the dirt, was not a gun or a piece of clothing. It was a woman's purse, the cheap faux leather purse Kendra had seen on the nightstand in room 23. But forensics had already collected the purse at the scene. This was a second one, or rather, the real one. Why would the killer take her purse and then bury it? Riley wondered aloud. Kendra's mind was racing. Because the one in the room was a plant, a decoy. He wanted it to look like a robbery wasn't the motive. He left the wallet with the cash in the room to sell the story of a crime of passion. This was a level of forethought that didn't fit the profile of a man who'd exploded in a fit of rage. This was calculated. This was staging. She carefully opened the purse. Inside was a wallet, a set of keys, and a tube of lipstick. But as she sifted through the contents, her gloved fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. It wasn't an ID or a credit card. She pulled it out. It was a burner phone, a cheap disposable flip phone, the kind people used when they didn't want their calls traced. The back was cracked and the screen was shattered, as if it had been smashed against a rock before being buried. Shadow, his job done, sat panting, looking from Riley to Kendra, awaiting his next command. But it was the discovery of the phone that made Kendra's blood run cold. Cheyenne had a secret phone, a phone for calls she didn't want on her regular bill, a phone for conversations with people who lived in the shadows. This changed everything. The case had been a straight line pointing to Lavelle Bradford. Now it had fractured into a dozen different possibilities. The dog hadn't found a scent trail leading to a fugitive. He had unearthed a conspiracy. The silent, shattered phone in her hand held secrets, and Kendra knew that if she could make it talk, it wouldn't just name a killer. It would blow the entire case wide open. "It's a miracle it's giving us anything at all," said Marco, the lead digital forensics tech. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, fueled by coffee and the thrill of the challenge. The SIM card was fried and the main board was fractured, but I was able to pull a few corrupted audio files from the phone's onboard memory, last recordings it ever made. Kendra leaned over his shoulder in the cool, dark forensics lab, the hum of servers a constant presence. On the screen was a sound wave, a jagged, broken line of peaks and valleys. "Can you play it?" "It's not much," Marco warned. "The file is damaged. I could only clean up a few seconds of it." He hit a key. The speakers crackled to life. First, there was the unmistakable sound of a woman's scream, Cheyenne's. It was sharp, terrified. It was followed by a man's voice, deep and guttural with rage. "You lying?" The word was cut off by a sickening thud, then static. Kendra's stomach clenched. It was the sound of the murder. "Wait," Marco said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "There's another fragment, right at the end." He played it again. After the thud and the static, another voice emerged from the garble, just for a second. It was different from the enraged man's voice. It was lower, colder, and terrifyingly calm. "Hurry up! Clean this up." 3 distinct voices. Cheyenne, an enraged man, presumably Lavelle Bradford, and a third man, calm and in control, giving orders. Kendra felt a jolt, as if she'd touched a live wire. Her theory was right. Lavelle wasn't alone. The crime of passion was a performance, and someone else was the director. "The third voice," she said, her own voice tight. "Can you isolate it? Run it against any voice prints we have in the database?" Already on it, Marco said. But it's a long shot. The sample is too short, too corrupted. It didn't matter. Kendra already knew who it belonged to. It was the voice of command, of power. It was the voice of a man who cleaned up messes. Armed with this new evidence, she drove straight back to the Spanish Moss Inn. There was one person who had been there that night, one person who saw everything and had lied to her face, Harold Jenkins. She found him in the lobby, exactly where she'd left him, hunched over a racing form. He looked up as she entered, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk about the security cameras, Harold. The real conversation this time." "I told you, they're dummies." He started to whine. "Don't," Kendra cut him off, her voice like ice. "Just don't. I have a recording from a second phone found at the scene. A recording of the murder. I have 3 voices on it. The victim, her killer, and a third man giving orders. Now, my next step is to get a warrant for your employment records, your phone records, your bank records, and I am going to comb through every inch of your miserable life until I find a connection to one of those men. Or you could just give me the damn hard drive from the security system." Harold paled, his sour demeanor crumbling into pure panic. He was a small man caught between a killer and a cop, and he was finally realizing which one was the more immediate threat. "They'll kill me," he whispered, wringing his hands. "I'll charge you with obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact to murder, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cell," Kendra promised, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Your choice." Defeated, Harold let out a long, shuddering sigh. He shuffled to a back office and returned with a small black box. "The DVR. He made me wipe it," he mumbled, not looking at her. "Said it was for the best." "Who made you wipe it?" "The big one. The one with the dog, Dante." Kendra took the DVR. "I'm sure my tech guys can find whatever you tried to erase." Back at the lab, Marco worked his magic again. He did a quick format, not a deep wipe. "Amateur hour," the tech scoffed. "I can recover the last 24 hours of footage." An hour later, Kendra was watching the grainy, time-stamped footage from the camera pointed at the motel's parking lot. At 8:05 p.m., a dark Ford F-150 pulled into a spot. A tall, well-built white man got out and walked toward room 23. Lavelle Bradford. At 11:17 p.m., the footage showed Lavelle stumbling out of the room. He looked agitated, panicked, just as Harold had described. He got in his truck and sped away. The case seemed closed. Lavelle was the killer, but Kendra kept watching. She trusted her gut, and her gut was still screaming. 5 minutes after Lavelle left, at 11:22 p.m., a second vehicle entered the frame. It was a black lifted pickup truck with custom rims, a truck befitting a man like Dante. It didn't pull into a parking spot. It backed up slowly, positioning itself so the passenger side was directly in front of the door to room 23, blocking the camera's view of the doorway itself. It sat there, engine idling, for 10 minutes. At 11:32 p.m., the truck pulled away and exited the motel. The video didn't show Dante. It didn't show Tavon. But it showed a second vehicle, his vehicle at the scene right after the murder. It was the missing piece. The 10-minute gap where the crime scene was staged, where the second purse was planted, where the crime of passion narrative was carefully constructed. Lavelle Bradford may have thrown the punch, but Tavon Gaines's crew had cleaned it up, and you only clean up a mess that you have a stake in. The question was no longer just who killed Cheyenne, but why a powerful man like Tavon Gaines would go to such lengths to cover it up. The knot of time had been untied, revealing a much larger, more sinister conspiracy. The net closed quickly. An all-points bulletin was issued for Lavelle Bradford. 3 hours later, a sharp-eyed officer at the Savannah bus station spotted him. He was trying to buy a one-way ticket to Miami, his face hidden under a baseball cap. He didn't resist arrest. The fight had already gone out of him. Simultaneously, a SWAT team, authorized by a now convinced Captain Miller, descended on the Onyx room. They found Dante in the back office, counting the night's earnings. He was taken by surprise, but the Rottweiler, Shadow's nemesis, was not. The dog lunged and was only subdued by a tranquilizer dart. They were both brought in. Kendra decided to start with Lavelle. She sat across from him in the stark gray interrogation room. He was a man deflated, the swagger from his bar fight days replaced by a hollow-eyed terror. "We know you were there, Lavelle," Kendra began, her voice calm. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, the text messages, Harold's identification, the video of his truck. We know you killed her. Lavelle just stared at his hands, cuffed to the table. I want a lawyer. You'll get one, Kendra said, but a lawyer can't change the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming. We have your skin cells from under her fingernails. She fought back, Lavelle. At the mention of his DNA, Lavelle flinched. That was the nail in the coffin, and he knew it. But here's what I don't understand, Kendra continued, leaning forward. I don't think you acted alone. I think someone helped you. I think someone told you what to do. Lavelle's head snapped up, a flicker of something, hope, fear, in his eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he mumbled, the words spilling out. I lost it. Tell me, Kendra urged, and the story came pouring out. He told her about meeting Cheyenne at a diner, about how he'd been charmed by her, how he thought he'd finally found a decent woman. He described the scene at the motel, the wine, the conversation. Then came the moment of discovery. I felt tricked, humiliated, he said, his voice thick with a self-pity that made Kendra's stomach turn. Like she was laughing at me. I just saw red. I screamed at her. I hit her. I don't even remember most of it clearly. It was just rage. He choked back a sob. When I came to my senses, she wasn't breathing. I panicked. And then what happened? Kendra pressed. I called the only person I knew who could handle something like this, he whispered. A guy I knew from the garage. He did side work for Tavon Gaines. I'd worked on his truck before. He owed me a favor. Dante, Kendra supplied. Lavelle nodded. I told him what happened. He told me to sit tight. He showed up a few minutes later. He wasn't alone. The air in the room grew still. Tavon Gaines was with him, Lavelle confirmed. This was the confession she needed, the one that tied the whole thing together. Tavon wasn't angry, Lavelle continued, his voice now a near inaudible whisper. He was calm. He looked at the body, and he looked at me. He told me I was an idiot, but that he could fix it. He told Dante to make it look right. Dante took her real purse, her burner phone, and told me to leave her other purse, to make sure the wallet was in plain sight. He told me to get out of town, to lay low. He said they would handle the rest, make it look like a freak out from a John. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. Tavon had used Lavelle's crime of passion as an opportunity. He hadn't ordered the murder, but he had orchestrated the cover-up with chilling efficiency. But why? Why would a man as powerful as Tavon Gaines risk everything to cover up a murder he didn't commit? Why, Lavelle? Kendra asked, her voice sharp. Why did he help you? Lavelle looked away, his fear of Tavon warring with his fear of a life sentence. Because Cheyenne knew something, he finally admitted. She'd overheard him on that burner phone, talking to someone, something about his clubs, about washing money. She didn't know what it meant, not really, but she told me she was scared. She was going to go to the police. Tavon must have known. He must have had her under surveillance. There it was, the grand unifying motive. It wasn't just about Cheyenne wanting to leave his stable of girls. It was about her stumbling, completely by accident, into his money laundering operation. Her death, at the hands of Lavelle Bradford, was a gift to Tavon Gaines. It solved his problem permanently, and he could pin it all on a convenient transphobic John. In the adjacent interrogation room, Dante, the hulking enforcer, was a stone wall. He said nothing. But when confronted with Lavelle's confession and the evidence from the burner phone, a voice analysis had confirmed the third voice was his. The cracks began to show. His loyalty to Tavon was strong, but his instinct for self-preservation was stronger. He lawyered up, but the damage was done. Lavelle Bradford, the man who let his wounded pride explode into murder, had confessed. But in doing so, he had also given them the key to bringing down a much larger monster. He had revealed that Cheyenne's death was not just a single act of hatred, but the nexus of a brutal crime and a cold, calculated conspiracy. The funeral for Cheyenne Tibbs was a quiet affair, held on a gray overcast Thursday. A light drizzle fell from the sky, blurring the green landscape of Bonaventure Cemetery into a watercolor of grief. Kendra stood at a respectful distance, beneath the draping limbs of a live oak, watching the small cluster of mourners gathered around the gravesite. She recognized Desiree, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. There were a few other young women, their faces a mixture of sorrow and fear, Cheyenne's sisters in survival. And there was an older couple, a man and a woman who stood slightly apart, their faces etched with a pain so profound it was hard to look at. Kendra guessed they were Cheyenne's parents, grappling with a loss no parent should ever have to endure. The legal fallout had been swift. Lavelle Bradford was charged with first-degree murder. With his confession and the mountain of forensic evidence, the DA was confident in a conviction that would put him away for life. Tavon Gaines and his enforcer, Dante, were hit with a slew of charges: accessory after the fact to murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence. The information from Lavelle had also kicked off a massive federal investigation into Gaines's financial empire. His world was crumbling. Justice, it seemed, was being served. But as Kendra watched the casket being lowered into the damp earth, the word justice felt hollow. It was a cold, clinical term for a process that could never restore what was lost. It couldn't give Cheyenne back her future. It couldn't erase the terror of her final moments. After the short service ended and the mourners began to disperse, drifting away like ghosts in the rain, Desiree approached Kendra. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but a new strength, a hard-won resolve, had replaced the terror Kendra had seen just days before. "They told me you got them," she said, her voice steady. "All of them." "Yes," Kendra confirmed. "He confessed, and Gaines's operation is being dismantled as we speak." "Good," Desiree nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It won't bring her back, but it's something. You saw her. You didn't just write her off as another dead call girl." "No one deserves what happened to her," Kendra said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the leaves. "You know the saddest part, Detective?" Desiree said, looking at the fresh mound of earth. "Cheyenne fought so hard. Her whole life was a fight to be seen, to be accepted, to just be the woman she knew she was. And in the end, she died because of it, because of who she was." Kendra thought for a moment, her gaze fixed on the single white rose someone had placed on the grave. "No," she said softly, turning to meet Desiree's eyes. "She didn't die because of who she was. She died because of who they were. She died because one man's hatred and another man's greed were more important to them than her life. That's not on her. That's on them. That's on a world that makes it so easy for that hatred and greed to exist." A faint, sad smile touched Desiree's lips. "Thank you," she whispered, forgiving her that. As Desiree walked away, Kendra remained by the grave for a few moments longer. The case was closed, the boxes ticked, the reports filed, but the story of Cheyenne Tibbs would stay with her. It was a stark reminder of the brutal complexity of her work. The case hadn't been a straight line. It was a tangled web of transphobia, racism, fragile masculinity, and cold corporate-style crime. It began as a story about one kind of hate and ended as a story about another. The lesson, she thought as she walked back to her car through the drizzling rain, wasn't just that monsters exist. It was that they wear many faces. Some scream their hatred in a fit of rage in a cheap motel room. Others whisper their commands from behind the mahogany desk of a fancy office. Both are equally deadly. Her job was not to rid the world of these monsters. That was a task far too great for any one person. Her job was to listen to the echoes left behind by the victims, to piece together their silent stories, and to ensure that their final truth was heard, loud and clear, in a courtroom. It wasn't a perfect system, and it wasn't always enough. But as the rain washed the city clean, Kendra Moss knew it was what mattered. It was the only thing that did.